Well, welcome back, especially to those online who may have been waiting. We got caught up in lunch and conversations here, and people are still coming back in. But we're looking forward to these two sessions, which are both going to be on Zoom. But before we do that, I just wanted to quickly share my PowerPoint from Simon. He's on it. Which is a Welcome to Theology Live 2022. If you're joining us and you weren't here earlier and when we did the welcome. And then the second slide is just to say to you what a fantastic 2021 was in terms of Baptist publications. And if you haven't seen any of them, there are some fantastic books that came out in 2021. And it might be that you want to engage with some of those and pick some of them up. And so we might put that up later. Some of them are from speakers today, some of their work in that way. And then the next slide, the Whitley Lecture. I have the privilege of giving it this year, so if you want to engage with that, it's happening at different points. There will be an online version, at least in the autumn, as well as being in different places as well. But do check out David McCaughlin's and Robert Parkinson's and others as another kind of example of Baptists doing theology. And then the last slide. I think it's the last slide. No, one before. Journals. Just to remind you of the journals, the BMJ has had a new facelift in terms of its front, so do check that out, the latest edition. The Baptist Quarterly has had a facelift as well, so do check that out. And both of them done by Mickey Monroe. And when I saw this, I decided that the Journal for Baptist Theology in Context probably needs a facelift, and so Mickey hopefully is going to give us a facelift as well. And so I guess the Journal for Baptist Theology in Context is the journal most associated with Theology Live. We hope that when people give a paper here, they might look to submit it for that journal, which is free to download, jbtc.org.uk. And also to draw your attention to the Journal of European Baptist Studies, which is also free to read. And you can read that as well. So there's other ways of resourcing you if you're interested. And then the last slide was just remind you of just of some of the work that Baptists are doing in our colleges and elsewhere, which is really exciting to see and encouraging us that Theology Live is just one event amongst others in this healthy Baptist theological conversation going on. Well, it's my privilege to hopefully to have Paul Fiddes online and welcome Paul. We've asked Paul, I guess, to give a keynote address, so he's got slightly longer than some of our other presenters. Paul, back in the day, was involved in something called Baptist Doing Theology in Context, which had a number of consultations. And part of the inspiration of Theology Live came out of that kind of work that was done in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And so it's great to welcome Paul Fiddes, still definitely the preeminent Baptist theologian in the UK, Professor of Systematic Theology at Oxford, Senior Research Fellow at Regent's Park College, and he's publishing like anything at the moment. He's had a book on Charles William and C.S. Lewis out last year, a book on Iris Murdoch, which he's going to be talking about today, a book shortly coming out on Shakespeare, and he's probably got more in the pipeline as well. So Paul, a very warm welcome to you. Over to you to bring your paper, thinking about Iris Murdoch and God. And I've lost a sheet of paper. Paul.
Well, thank you very much for your welcome. Am I audible?
Yes.
Oh, good. Yeah. And good to see everyone. Can I just ask to have the screen sharing so I can? It says that the screen sharing has been disabled because I've got a PowerPoint here that I alerted you to. But I can't share the screen. Oh, there we go.
Hopefully you can now, Paul.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, so there's my title, Iris Murdoch, the Human Person and Theology. There may be some here who aren't familiar with the work of the Oxford philosopher and novelist Iris Murdoch, or Dame Iris, as she became in 1987. There may be those who only know Murdoch as the Iris in a film of her life, of that name starring Judi Dench, or Dame Judi Dench. We might say it takes one dame to play another. Many people who've seen the film know Iris Murdoch only as a clever woman who succumbed to Alzheimer's disease in 1999 after a period when she returned virtually to early childhood. The film dwells on the tragedy of a great mind brought low by terrible affliction, and you'd learn very little of her 26 novels and 4 books of philosophy from watching it. So for those who aren't familiar with Iris Murdoch, I'll begin by a few remarks on her career, which will serve to introduce her preoccupation throughout her life with the meaning and the flourishing of the human person. In 1948, she became tutorial fellow in philosophy at St. Anne's College, a college for women in the University of Oxford, at the age of 29, and she was to remain there for 25 years. Early in this period, she became deeply interested in the philosopher Simone Weil, a Christian mystic who died near the end of the Second World War. To be truly human, Weil thought, we need to give the other our attention, and through that other, to attend to the one who's supremely personal, God. This conviction was summed up in the title of one of her books, Waiting on God. Murdoch was to take up the idea of giving attention to other persons and things in the world, though the greater reality to which we should attend was not to be a personal God, but the good as conceived by Plato. We are to wait on the good with no hope of reward. Murdoch began working out these ideas in a series of novels as well as essays in philosophy, publishing her first novel in 1954. In 1970, she published her best-known book on philosophy entitled The Sovereignty of Good, and this brought to full expression the idea of attention to the good that I've already mentioned. By then, she'd also published 13 novels. In 1956, she'd married John Bailey, who was later to become an Oxford Professor of English Literature, but she was involved in a number of love affairs before and after the marriage. The passion and pain of love was for her deeply embedded in being human and was reflected in her own life. But for Murdoch, love ultimately meant, like Plato, love of the good. In 1963, she resigned her fellowship in philosophy at St. Anne's, partly as the result of a messy love affair. She turned to being a full-time novelist, but one more book on philosophy was yet to come, her largest and also the one where she shows herself most interested in theology. This was Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals, published in 1992, by which time she'd published 24 novels. The title says it all. The metaphysics are, of course, Platonist, a belief in a transcendent supreme good. And this is a guide to morals because attention to this good turns the human person away from self-centeredness to notice other persons and objects of beauty. 2 more novels were to come, but Murdoch found immense difficulty in finishing the last as she was succumbing to the onset of Alzheimer's disease. She died of Alzheimer's in 1999. The film Iris, based on John Bailey's memoir of his wife, appeared as early as 2001. In this talk, I want to consider Murdoch's understanding of the human person, and I hope that as theologians, you might find it interesting as one attempt, as she describes it herself, to do theology without believing in God. So the first thing to say about Murdoch's view of human nature is that the authentic person pays attention to the other. For Murdoch, learning to be truthful means giving attention to what is real around us. At one level of reality, this means noticing people as they actually are, rather than as we want them to be for our convenience. It means delighting in all the contingent details of the world, recognizing the otherness of people and things, and living with all the hazards of accident. At the very least, the disciples of the good accept the muddle of the world, and at the best, they experience its amazing variety as being the sublime. A prominent symbol for the hardness and separateness of objects in their own right is the stones with which Murdoch strews her landscapes. Characters in her novels marvel at the myriad of pebbles upon the beach, each different from the other. Sinclair, in her novel The Book on the Brotherhood, has made a notable collection of pebbles and had known each individual stone personally and given some of them names. When Anne Cabbage, in Nuns and Soldiers, meets Jesus Christ in a vision, he shows her a small stone, reminiscent of the Lady Julian's account in her mystical treatise of how she was shown a little thing the size of a hazelnut. Anne is in the agonizing predicament of loving a man who has himself been loving her friend Gertrude devotedly and without reward for many years. Should she tell him her own love? By showing her a stone, Christ makes clear there is no easy answer, no instant salvation. She must find the truth of her situation, which is there like the integrity of the stone, existing in its own truth. However, human persons fail often to give attention to others. Murdoch gives us a number of images for this. The first is building a private world around ourselves, our own universe. Jake, in her very first novel, Under the Net, sets the tone for a long list of successors when he exclaims of a friend that I count Finn as an inhabitant of my universe and cannot conceive that he has one containing me. Murdoch exposes the tragic fact that we all manufacture worlds for ourselves. Similar images for the cosmic artifacts that we build and imprison ourselves within are boxes, dark cupboards, cages, and eggs. The mythical form in which this human condition is presented in her novels is the fable of the imprisoned princess. In some novels, women are literally imprisoned, as for example, in The Sea, Charles Araby shuts up his former childhood sweetheart, Hartley, now an elderly woman, in a dark room in order to protect her, he thinks, from her husband and recapture her love. Behind all these images of confinement, there lies the Platonic myth of the cave and the inhabitants of a world of shadows. In Murdoch's synthesis of Freud and Plato, the fire in the cave is the ego, aping the sun outside and producing illusions in which the cave dwellers are content to live. When we reject truth, we find ourselves in what Murdoch calls the void. Our self-made world is empty. The cave is inhabited only by shadows. It's characteristic of this hell to find that the contingent details of the world, the jumble of life, are not a delight, but a horror. The experience of the sublime has been reversed into vertigo, a negative vision. The myriad stones upon the beach that can symbolize joy and the variety of the world can also become the occasion for nausea at the sheer contingency of things. Theo, in The Nice and the Good, has some sense of the demands of the good, but has not been strong enough to pursue it. And he finds the stones on the Dorset coast to be terrible in their factuality. We read that the mauve and white pebbles were a nightmare to Theo. Their multiplicity and randomness appalled him. The children he is with lovingly collect the stones as a treasury of lovable individuals. But for Theo, they are a dead opacity of matter and an expanse of abomination where the spirit had never come. The stones are jumble and desolation. And he goes on to wonder, was not all jumble and desolation? Was it not all an expanse of senseless random matter? and he himself as meaningless as these stones, since in real truth there was no God. These characters face the horror of things because they fail to give attention to others. Murdoch emphasizes that this giving attention means the death of the self. To give attention to other things and people is to love goodness as well as truth, because it means unselfing or decentering from herself, from oneself. In her novel, The Unicorn, Effingham Cooper faces death by drowning in a bog, and in a moment of revelation, he discovers the passion of a lover for all that was not himself. We read, "This then was love, to look and look until one exists no more. This was the love that was the same as death. He looked and knew with a clarity which was one with the increasing light, that with the death of the self, the world becomes quite automatically the object of a perfect love." The person then seeks truth in noticing others, and in this, the person is open to what we may call grace. For Murdoch, to escape from our own box, to crack the hard ego, to wake from the dream, or to smash the shell of the egg in which we're sheltering, can't be achieved simply by an act of our own will. Christian theologians speak of grace as a gift from beyond us, which enables us to turn from the security of idols and to live courageously in the tensions of life. Now, Murdoch believes that the defeat of egoism requires moral effort, but she disagrees with Jean-Paul Sartre that willpower is everything. She discerns the need for something analogous to grace. Something, she says, to enable the reorientation of an energy which is naturally selfish. What becomes of grace, she asks, in a world without God? The first form which these ministers of grace assume in Murdoch's novels is the shock of an unexpected event or unlikely relationship. The contingent, accidental events of the world which her characters try to shut out can break in suddenly to disturb their neat, self-enclosed worlds. They're shocked into noticing others. They're jolted towards the truth. At the same time, of course, the shock operates upon the reader. For instance, the love affairs which develop are odd, challenging our tidy ideas of how people behave. They cut across the usual barriers. Old and young fall in love together. Brothers and sisters love each other incestuously. People move from heterosexual to same-sex relations and back again. Class divisions are crossed. One member of an exclusive group falls in love with an outsider, and someone who's hated at one moment becomes the object of passionate love at another. Critics protest, but people don't behave like this. Yet Murdoch is unveiling the unpredictability of human nature to which we're often blind. And at the same time, she's made the relationships and passions she describes even more erratic, because she wants to startle us out of our self-created worlds. She allows that literature must resort to tricks, what she calls magic, in order to reveal what is real. Good art can lie its way into the truth. Murdoch designs accidental events or unlikely relationships to disturb her characters and her readers into noticing the truth. That's the proper craft of an artist, who can only reflect what is real through some artifice. And here we're already considering the second of Murdoch's means of grace, which is the art object itself, and especially literature. In her essays on philosophy and art, as well as through conversations in her novels, Murdoch makes clear that good art reveals the minute, random detail of the world. Art achieves liberation from self and an awakening to truth through its patterns and consoling forms. by its intense otherness, it diverts our attention from ourselves and prompts a quest for the truth. Indeed, if it's good art, the artist has already been attending to what is particular, other than himself or herself in the making of the artifact. In Murdoch's novel, The Bell, Dora looks at her favorite pictures in the National Gallery and sees them as something real outside herself, which spoke to her kindly and yet in sovereign tones, destroying the dreary, trance-like solipsism. Indeed, Murdoch suggests that reflection upon art is a kind of religious experience. In her book on Plato, The Fire and the Sun, she is more favorable to art than Plato, declaring that art perhaps provides for many people in an unreligious age without prayer or sacraments their clearest experience of something grasped as separate and precious and beneficial and held quietly and unpossessively in the attention. Good art which we love can seem holy, and attending to it can be like praying. The effect is intensified when the work of art is already a religious symbol, whether in visual art or story. In The Bell, two visitors to a religious community at Imber, Dora and Toby, find the old Abbey bell at the bottom of the lake where it's lain hidden for centuries, and they raise it secretly at night. Gazing on it, Dora feels reverence for it as she had for the portraits in the gallery. It was a thing from another world. The gospel story of the life of Christ, as graven by the medieval artist on the bell, has power to arouse the attention of the observer to what is real. We read, "The squat figures faced her from the sloping surface of the bronze, solid, simple, beautiful, absurd, full to the brim with something which was to the artist not an object of speculation or imagination. These scenes had been more real to him than his childhood and more familiar. He had reported them faithfully." The members of the community at Imber certainly need to have their attention drawn to the truth of the world and other people. Though they're a lay religious community living in the grounds of an abbey, they're failing to exercise their spiritual impulses in a way that makes for truth. The inscription on the bell is apt for them and also leads us to consider a third means of grace which Murdoch finds for the egocentric self. The bell announces, "Vox ego sum amoris, Gabriel vocor. I am the voice of love. I am called Gabriel." So falling in love can be an annunciation, the message of an angel shocking the ego into awareness of someone else's distinct being. Through the energy of the dark eros, Murdoch writes, the center of significance is suddenly ripped out of the self. The lover's attention is turned to the beloved and thence outwards to live in the dangerous, real, contingent world. As in Plato, eros desire can be the first step towards desire for the good as it's manifested in other beings. In such moments, there is what Murdoch has called a revelation, a flash from a higher level. Art can act like this, revealing the really real, she says. And Murdoch's characters, like Dora in The Bell, sometimes have such experiences looking at pictures in galleries. And so there's a fourth means of grace. Beyond the good of accepting the reality of others, beyond loving the contingent details of the world, beyond art, there is an ultimate good. There is a supreme moral value, which Murdoch calls the sovereignty of good. Goodness is there, transcending all the particularities of life. It isn't a subjective illusion and has what Murdoch calls a magnetic power to pull us out of our self-centered selves. For Murdoch, it's not possible to have a personal relation with this good. We must be good for nothing, for no reward, even the compensation of a mutual relation with the divine. Eugene, in The Time of the Angels, once prayed to the bearded Russian god, but now the building was empty and there's nothing but the darkness. He loves an icon of the Trinity he possesses, but it is, he thinks, the blank image of goodness from which all personality had been withdrawn. This sovereign good is strictly unreachable. It is the unnameable good of Plato or the imageless God of St. John of the Cross. We cannot attain the ultimate good. Nevertheless, Murdoch believes the good itself can be loved and meditated upon. It can be a central point of reflection, even though it's invisible and cannot be represented. She thinks that talk of God can be an apt symbol for this transcendent good, since the idea of God provides for believers what she calls a non-degradable love object. In religious terms, these traces of the good are like one divine spirit dispersed into the many particulars of the world. In mythical terms, as expounded by her character Carol Fisher in The Time of the Angels, the death of God has set the angels free. He says, angels are the thoughts of God. Now he has been dissolved into his thoughts, which are beyond our conception in their nature and their multiplicity and their power. God was at least the name of something which we thought was good. Now even the name has gone and the spiritual world is scattered. In this novel, Murdoch is responding to the death of God movement in the 1960s. This theological movement was all about facing up to the modern consciousness of loss and absence of God. The question for Murdoch is whether it's possible to go on striving for the good. Carol is an Anglican rector who's come to the conviction that there is no God. Aptly, he's been moved to a parish in the middle of London, which is nothing more than a demolition site. The rectory where he lives is standing in the middle of a waste area of mud without a church and with no houses to serve. Carol's reaction to the loss of God is to surrender to evil. He knows that the single good has been scattered into the many, but these he regards as forces of chance which are inevitably hostile to human life. They're not indications of any unified transcendent good, but simply roaming and malicious powers. He realizes that God is only good if one is good for nothing, but he believes such a stance to be totally impossible. If there is no God, then there is no single universal good to be grasped, and consequently, there is no goodness at all. This conclusion isn't, of course, a necessary one. It's a choice he makes. Murdoch herself does believe in the unity of good. This she summarizes in The Sovereignty of Good as a single, perfect, transcendent, non-representable, and necessarily real object of attention. This single good can, however, only be known through the many contingent things in the world. Other characters in her novels adopt her own stance of serving this good for nothing, and so find the particulars of the world, though awful, to be also beautiful. Carol, however, creates his own universe around himself and makes himself God. The contingent becomes a horror to him, as to all who do so. In his own language, the angels become terrors and he is their prey. He is in a hellish underworld, of which the underground railway that rumbles away beneath the rectory is a constant reminder. Murdoch shows herself acutely aware that all the means of grace she presents can be corrupted. And so we come to another feature of the person. The person must resist the lure of the shadows of Plato's cave, understood as Freud's illusions. What ought to be instruments of truth can be bent into tools of fantasy and manipulation. Instead of being pulled out of themselves, many of her characters fall into a deeper prison of the self. For instance, while accidental events and unlikely relationships can shock people into noticing the truth, it's a mark of self-centeredness to want to procure shocks for others. This is to attempt to wield a kind of magical power over others' lives by a sheer act of will. Even the grace of art can be corrupted. An art object can be used for the black magic of self-indulgence. In The Bell, for example, Dora intends to use an art object to produce a shocking event. She plans a miracle which she hopes will shake the community out of its self-righteousness with its patronizing view of her as the penitent wife. She's going to use the bell to make an accidental thing happen. A new bell is to be installed at the Abbey, led there in a procession, veiled in white. She plans to substitute the medieval bell, raised in secret from the bottom of the lake, for the modern one. She reflects, think of the sensation. It will be like a real miracle, the sort of thing that makes people go on pilgrimages. I should like to shake everybody up a bit. She felt as if by the sheer force of her will, she could make the great bell rise. After all, and after her own fashion, she would fight. In this holy community, she would play the witch. In the end, though she does raise the bell successfully, with the aid of a young visitor of the community, Toby, she does not carry her plot through. Gazing upon the bell, she knows that to use it for a trick would be to betray its truth. We read, she thought to be its master and make it her plaything, but now it was mastering her and having its will. She remembers a phrase, the truth-telling voice that must not be silenced. So she gives voice to the truth by throwing herself against the bell and making its mighty tongue ring out, calling people to the barn where the bell has been hidden. Another illusion to be resisted is that another person can simply save us without our having to make our own moral effort to let the ego die. Blaise, in The Sacred and Profane Love Machine, is married to Harriet, but has a secret second family with his mistress, Emily. When he tells Harriet about Emily, he carefully shapes the account in a letter to her, which he himself finds very moving, stating that the relationship lasted only briefly, that he long ago ceased to find Emily attractive, and that he visits her only at intervals for the sake of the child. None of this is true. When Harriet forgives him, he believes himself to be saved. He says to her, in now confessing this, I can only cast myself on your love as a religious person casts himself onto God. I ask you, madly perhaps, for your love as the only instrument of salvation. The extra power which can save the world can only come from your perfect love, my angel and my wife. Blaise, however, is using her forgiveness to avoid dealing with the situation of Emily, which he intends to continue. For Murdoch, Christ above all must not be treated as such an easy savior. But there's still something about the figure of Christ that fascinates Murdoch. One of Murdoch's priests, Father McAllister, has no real belief in the objective existence of God or the resurrection of Christ either. But like other priests in Murdoch's novels, he finds that he can know what he calls a mystical Christ, who is the way of truth for him. In her final book of philosophy, Murdoch confesses that for her too, the mystical Christ is a constant companion, present in a way which can't be explained rationally. This is a Christ who is not literally resurrected, but who faced the fact of death in all its terrible contingency, and who thus enables us to love the good. One of the greatest human illusions is to embrace suffering as a masochistic self-indulgence, and so to avoid the real death for Murdoch, which is the death of the self. Christ didn't avoid death, thinks Murdoch. He was obedient to the good, accepting a death whose horror he fully comprehended. But Christianity has gone wrong, thinks Murdoch, by replacing death by a love of suffering. All this is exquisitely summed up in the visionary appearing of Christ to Anne Cavendish in Murdoch's novel Nuns and Soldiers. In response to Anne's plea that she wants to be saved, to be made good, and to be washed whiter than snow, Christ gently insists that you must do it all yourself, and I am not a magician. She can't push away her responsibilities onto him, for he bids her, as he did Mary Magdalene, love me if you must, my dear, but don't touch me. She cannot cling to an easy savior, but must find the way of truth for herself through the tangles of her love, though Christ can be followed and even loved as the one who took this path himself. Christ has certainly suffered wounds on the cross and on the way to it, but they themselves cannot save. When she looks at his unscarred hands, he says paradoxically, my wounds are imaginary. That is, he explains, the suffering is not the point, though it's proved so interesting to you all. As a result of her visionary meeting with Christ, Anne is convinced that there is no personal God. Yet the finger with which she tried, like Mary Magdalene in the gospel narrative, to grasp him and keep him with her will not heal up. We read, it came to her that he was real, that he was unique. She was an atom of the universe, and he was her own Christ, the Christ that belonged to her, laser beamed to her alone from infinitely far away. This inner reflection continues the idea in the sovereignty of good that Christ is one of those particular things or persons in the world, like even a stone, that can awaken attention to the good and can be a focus of meditation. Let's sum up. For Murdoch, the human person flourishes in giving attention to others and finally to the good, and in resisting all the illusions that trap us in Plato's cave. But we're left with uncertainty about what the death of the self means. It should mean simply the death of the selfish self, the egoistic self. But we can't help but notice that characters in her novels who serve the impersonal good for no reward strangely lack a substantial self. To take a selection of them, Stuart appears to be a corpse, a dead man. Kathleen seems to her husband to possess unlife. Tallis is regarded as an unperson, and Jenkins' friends made nothing of him. The impersonal good seems to have transferred its impersonality to them. Christian theologians have a way of viewing the human person as something solid and substantial. It is made so by communion with a personal God. In the Baptist tradition, this is called covenant. Of course, this doesn't mean that God is a personal being in the image of humanity. It also does not mean that talk of God as personal is a literal description. God is unique and unclassifiable, and so all speech about God must be metaphorical. But the theological claim is that talk of God as personal is the most appropriate or suitable language we have and enables us to express the experience that communion with God increases human personality. Murdoch isn't altogether consistent here. On the one hand, she declares that personal language about God is merely symbolic of an impersonal good, so all personalizing of what is transcendent should be replaced. But on the other hand, she admits that all language about unconditional reality is symbolic, including the words, the good. While on the one hand, she writes that the old God symbolized the good, on the other, she suggests that the Platonic metaphor of the idea of the good provides a suitable picture. Again, she urges that with regard to the existence of the good, we can only appeal to certain areas of experience and use suitable metaphors. Now, if all language about our ultimate concern is symbolic or metaphorical, whether God or Murdoch's good, then there is surely still a place for personal symbols in talking about it. As we've seen, Murdoch thinks that consolation in art, and especially in religious symbols, need not be an illusion, though it often is. It's striking that when Murdoch looks for a symbol of transcendence that will turn her to the good, it's a personal symbol that attracts her, the mystical Christ. One of her characters declares, "If Christ saves, he lives. That is, if Christ can transform human life, he must have a kind of life. And this life that transcends time is personal." As she wrote in her journal, just after writing Nuns and Soldiers, "Nothing can separate us from the love of Christ."
Thank you, Paul, for that engaging, for some of us perhaps, introduction to Iris Murdoch. For others, we might be more of aware of her work in some way. I wonder if there are any questions. Simon, if you've got any there that have turned up in the chat. Okay, we're just pondering what we've heard. Any questions here? Simon, go for it while anyone here in
Whilst
person.
others are getting their thoughts together. We've had a question from Simon on the chat. Commentators seem to think Murdoch found more in Buddhism than Christianity regarding her search for techniques for unselfing. Is that a later projection?
Well, at the same time she began to talk about the mystical Christ, she was talking about the mystical Buddha, and mostly after a visit to Japan. And she says that Christ can become for the West what Buddha is for the East. But I don't think that for one moment she got this idea of the mystical Christ actually from Buddhism. It is much more to do with her reading of Simone Weil and her meditation upon the reality that's present to us. In fact, I think you could say she projected it the other way onto the mystical Buddha. Her idea of that, I think, was very much shaped by her idea of the mystical Christ. She did at one point say that she was a kind of Christian Buddhist, but most reading, I think, would show it doesn't go very deeply into her.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got another question, Paul. No, press the button at the bottom, hold it in. Oh no, it is on. There we go.
Okay. Paul, I wonder if you could comment a little bit more on how she conceived of the good, and in particular whether it has moral imperatives, and if so, how she grounded those moral imperatives absent a personal being behind them. It seems to me that morality is a function of personhood almost. We don't speak of rocks having moral imperatives or generating moral imperatives. So how did she handle those questions?
Well, as I think I was trying to say, for her, the good is impersonal, and you can't actually describe this because it is unclassifiable, rather, as people have said about God, but it is a magnetic power to lift us out of ourselves, to notice others, and to give them the kind of place in our world that they should have, and therefore it's moral. Morality she saw as being allowing the other to be as they really are, to love them as they are. And so the good is not only truth, but morality. My point was that when she comes to think about this, she inevitably uses personal symbols about it. And therefore, I think undermines really her own view that this is a totally impersonal concept. Does that begin to answer the question? It's a question of language here. I mean, she says, well, the good is a personal symbol for God, is a personal symbol for the good, only a symbol for the good. But then she admits that actually talk of the good is also symbolic. And she seems to have no other way of talking about it, in fact, than the personal, though she says it's impersonal.
Yeah, and it's striking that you use the language of love,
Yes.
because that is inherently personal language.
Yes. Yes. Which I think, which is why personal language for that which ultimately concerns us, as Tillich put it, is inevitable. We can't do without that personal language. So I think you can see that tension within her, that she's giving this priority to love and to the noticing of other persons. And so it's actually quite a struggle to describe the good as being impersonal. What she's doing is reacting against a sort of naive picture of God as a super being that she obviously thinks is what is traditional Christian thought. She's dealing really, I think, with a straw God, one might say, rather than a straw man.
We've got another question coming from Tim, Paul.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction to Iris for me. Thank you, too, for the biographical information you gave at the beginning. Do you feel that, to what extent was she able to live out her philosophy in practice? Is it something she aspired to herself? Did she succeed or fail in terms of unselfing through her philosophy?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that she gave attention to others, and she does place love at the center of life. This often got her into a lot of tangles and a lot of so I think the concern to allow others to be genuinely who they are, and the concern to place love at the center of life, is she certainly worked out. You have to see how really startling this is in contrast to all the analytic philosophy going on at Oxford at the time. I mean, she is a philosopher, but she wants to tackle the big questions of what it is to be human, and isn't satisfied with the kind of linguistic philosophy that others are doing.
Simon's, I think, got another question from the chat online, Paul.
Yeah, Paul, there's a couple of interesting questions in the chat. I'll put them both to you and let you pick and choose. The first one is from Jeffrey. It is, Jesus replied, "Why do you call me good? Only God is good," Mark 10:18. Is there a contradiction at the heart of impersonal good and a mystical Christ as an explanation of the good? And then the second one is from Christine. I notice you refer to truth in your presentation. Can you unpack how Murdoch understands truth?
Right. Well, of course, the passage from the Gospel identifies God and good, and that's been fundamental to the Christian tradition. God is the supreme good, the summum bonum. When you say, is there a contradiction between an impersonal good and a mystical Christ as an explanation of the good, that's precisely the point I was making about Murdoch. I think that is the contradiction in her thinking, that she wants to think of the good as impersonal, but then as a clue to this good, as a way to this good, as a sign of this good, it is the mystical Christ that she finds indispensable, who always travels with her. So that is, I think, the contradiction at the heart of her thinking. The truth, well, as hoped I was saying, the truth is to notice what is real. It is not to live in illusions, but to give full attention to what is really there in other persons and things.
Okay. Well, Paul, thank you for that introduction to Iris Murdoch. You might want to go out, well, you might not be able to because it's quite expensive in hardback in the moment, but it might come out into paperback in the future. Paul's broader book looking at Iris Murdoch and theology. And Paul, one of your gifts, and I know one of your interests, is how we can learn from the novelist or from literature as a way of doing theology, and not just as an illustration, but a contribution. And you've helpfully done that by using the work of Iris Murdoch for us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to go to Ruth